Sort of 50s, it's sort of Venetian, it's very...
You bring us back in.
Should I pull this down to me, or is that?
No, just leave it. You're
You're
good.
good.
We want to have your whole face in the movie.
You were on it, our show
Three.
before.
I have not.
2,
No, okay.
Tom.
If you haven't seen it, that's the theme music, Eliza's theme from Shape of Water, a wonderful movie. Think 50s sci-fi romance.
Nice.
And put everything else to the side and just enjoy the wonderful photography. Very different story, and just really neat music.
Yeah.
It deservedly won the Oscar.
And just in case you don't notice, audience, Tom picks out some really nice music. That was to complement the fact that Cam Davis is running for Water Reclamation District, and I love when you make those connections.
It was also to soothe into the next topic with our friend
He's
Mark
keeping
Miller,
us
who's
mellow.
going to jolt us.
Right. Well,
Into how we deal with trauma. And it's a really fascinating take, Mark.
Thank
We
you.
haven't had a chance to read the book because it's just out,
Yes.
but we've heard excerpts, seen some excerpts and some great reviews already. And in fact, I thought the take in Chronicle Philanthropy was really interesting. And not to get ahead of this
Yeah.
conversation, what people do with trauma in their lives, I think, is a really interesting approach that you've taken here. So, longtime editor, writer, colleague of mine during my days at the Community Media Workshop, Mark Miller, why did you write this particular book?
So for about the last 10 years since I left local media, I've been specializing in writing nationally about topics related to retirement and aging. And one of the things that first got me interested in that was people making midlife, career, and life changes. And I just thought it was an interesting phenomenon, kind of a baby boomer thing going on out there. And I've continued to track that, although I cover a wide array of topics within the retirement and aging space, things like Social Security and healthcare and public policy topics. But within this topic of people making changes in their lives, over the years, interviewing people, I started noticing when I would ask, well, what is it that motivated you to make this change from place A to place B in your life? I would start getting these readbacks of terrible traumatic things that had happened, that had just stopped this person cold in their tracks, made them rethink everything about their life, and then they're off on this new pathway. So they've come out of these awful traumatic events experiencing what you might call a growth experience. And I was hearing it enough that I wanted to know more about it, so I researched and wrote a feature magazine piece about it in 2015. And in doing the research, I stumbled across a whole school of research in the world of psychology, and that this has been under study for many years, and the people who pioneered the research had given it a name, and the name is post-traumatic growth syndrome. So now I'm going, oh, it's a thing. It's not just me hearing these random stories. So now I'm really intrigued, and that's how I decided to write the book. And the book goes well beyond just the kind of the career change thing. It also goes well beyond stories of older people. Well, that was my starting point. But I interview a wide array of different types of people who have had a lot of different types of traumatic events in their lives, and then a lot of different types of growth responses. Sometimes it's a social mission. I'm out to, many times I want to address the problem that impacted me, but not exclusively that. And sometimes they're more subtle internal responses.
What is the most traumatic experience that you include in your book?
I think it's a hard question because there's some pretty
A couple
horrendous
would be
stories.
fine.
A really horrendous one is the story of Marietta Yeager, who in the 1970s was on a camping trip in Montana with her husband and parents and kids, and her 7-year-old daughter was abducted out of their tent in the middle of the night by, it turned out, a serial killer who had subsequently was found out was responsible for the deaths of a number of children. And it was 2 years before they found out what happened to Susie. Marietta was a housewife in Detroit in the 1970s, and her story of transformation is she came to a point of forgiveness of the killer. She actually tried to argue to get him off death row.
Wow. Those people blow my mind.
The murderer wound up committing suicide in jail, so the death row thing was taken off the table. Marietta, however, went on to become a lifelong death penalty abolitionist. And when I say lifelong, she's
that
now in
just
her...
gives me chills.
When I say lifelong, she's now in her 80s. And she travels the world. She's part of an amazing group of people called the Journey of Hope, which annually gets together to campaign against the death penalty. They typically go to death penalty states like Texas. So they go to the Death Belt, and they'll campaign against the death penalty. They stage an annual protest outside the Supreme Court. And Mariette is an incredible person, the strength and courage she has demonstrated. So to me, that's the most
And compassion.
devastating story, but there's a lot of them in the
So
book.
how does the post-traumatic growth or jolt occur? I'm sure there are many paths, but
Right.
is there a similarity?
I think the essence of it is that it's an experience that blows apart your sense of your life.
Okay.
Now, we walk around with kind of a self-constructed sense of what our lives are, right? The
Yep.
town I live in, my family, my friends, the radio show I do every Saturday, all these things that are just our worldview.
That's right.
And trauma of this type blows that up. And people are forced to put something back together. And in many cases, what they're trying to do is restore a sense of meaning and purpose in their life. And so it's like a clean slate. And people it just can result in these very dramatic transformations.
So you've covered people who actually do put something new and possibly better back together in their lives. What about people who don't experience that
Yeah.
kind of growth?
So that was something I was very concerned about in writing the book, because the last thing I wanted to convey here to people who are suffering a traumatic life experience was that there's something wrong with you if you don't experience this, and that's not the message at all. This is something that does happen in some cases. In fact, it happens fairly frequently. A little tangent to your question that I'm going to come back
Oh,
to.
go crazy.
We're full of
You
tangents.
guys do a lot
here.
of tangents.
Yeah,
here, so
we're
forgive me,
tangent-oriented.
We're good at this.
The psychologists who treat people in clinical settings on this stuff talk about never wanting to have an expectation of growth. If the person they're treating seems to be moving that way, then they want to explore it and encourage it if they can, but they never try to put it out there that you should be having this experience.
Right.
So I actually have a chapter on this. It's like, what happens if you don't have this? I actually interview a couple of people who not only didn't have the experience, but are sort of a little bit ticked off.
Ticked off, yes.
Yeah, one is the writer Megan Dahm in New York, who wrote a great op-ed about a near-death experience that she had, and from a virus. So this is this random thing, and the headline on her op-ed was, "I almost died. So what?" And I said, I got to talk to her, and I did.
Very good.
So I don't want to convey the message that this is like something that just like ought to happen, but it's a fascinating phenomenon. Now, I asked the psychologist, well, how often does it happen? So their tongue-in-cheek answer is anywhere from 30 to 90% of cases. And the reason it's such a
Because no one
weird
follows
number,
up.
well, no, because it's like it depends how you measure growth.
Sure.
So the 90% side would be, I wake up in the morning glad to be alive. I'm appreciative of still being here. That's a growth response.
Sure.
But it's not the same growth response as a Marietta.
Right.
The book is Jolt, Stories of Trauma and Transformation by Mark Miller. Mostly stories about individuals who've had to cope with major changes in their life. But I want to project this to, for lack of a
To
better
waking up
phrase,
to Trump being elected?
well, that would be one example.
Yeah.
National traumas, parkland
Yeah.
shootings,
Right.
natural disasters like the hurricane season we were
Yeah.
just through or whatever. Is there a way to extrapolate from individuals coping with trauma to this national experience where we all end up fixated on the television or social media but wonder what to do next?
Well,
Right.
so two observations about that. One is I think in stories like Parkland, we see post-traumatic growth playing out live before our eyes. But we don't very often, we the media, we don't stop very often to freeze that frame and ask what's going on there. We just kind of almost take it for granted. So, for example, the Sandy Hook parents are now back in the news because of Parkland. Okay, there's the Sandy Hook parents 5 years later still fighting
Right.
for change. But that's just sort of taken for granted. What I'm doing is freezing the frame and saying, what really is inside that story that turns these people into these courageous fighters? Okay? So you're asking the question, though, is there something like sort of a mass trauma phenomenon?
Do we grow as a people when we suffer as a people something we didn't cause or
Yeah.
but that ends up?
I think it's possible. I've interviewed a couple of psychologists who study PTG, post-traumatic growth, about this, who their response was, when I posed that theory, like I said to one, is it possible that half the United States right now is traumatized by the ascent of an authoritarian regime in the White House? And her response was, really interesting theory, it needs more study. But she didn't dismiss it. So And she's done a little bit of work on sort of group response. This is a woman who's done some studies on what happens in a small Midwestern town that has a flood, and she's studied the community. But at the national level, you look at the Me Too movement. The way that caught fire, I think that's a traumatic response.
Yeah.
I can't prove that
Oh,
clinically, but I in my gut,
I
having
think you're
studied
onto
it at the
something.
individual level, I think that's the case.
Or the way the city grieved the shooting of the police commander. To my mind was another one of these things where I'm not sure, other than the natural wanting to join with the family in this tragedy and all that, and wanting to support our police at a time when they've been under attack because of other issues. But I'm not sure what we're getting out of that as a city, other than we went through the funeral and all that, and now the perpetrator has been charged. But I'm not sure that we're getting growth out of it. That's why I was intrigued.
I think that in these public stories, what you hope to get out of it is activism and change. That's about the best I could say. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of cases. That's what you want to see.
Yeah.
That's what you want to hope for.
So again, we're talking to Mark Miller, who has authored a book called Jolt, Stories of Trauma and Transformation. And while we just moved it to the general populace, you are really dealing with individual stories. I like the idea of moving it to a general population thing. I mean, I recall being completely traumatized by Katrina, 500 miles away. And I think there was a huge segment of the population going through that. And I have felt a general social malaise really since the non-election of George Bush in 2000, which also had that effect. If we switch over to, first of all, where do people get your book? Because we didn't have one to read ourselves before. Now it's available.
I encourage people to get it from their independent bookstore instead of the big you-know-who.
Yeah,
and I'm going to be at City Lit Chicago on the 14th, Wednesday this week, talking about the book in Logan Square.
Great.
And signing books, so come out there. Or go to your other local bookstore and get
So
it.
it's
if they don't
widely
have it,
available.
ask them to order it.
Right, so Women and Children First, booksellers, go ahead.
While we have you here, I can't help but ask a question about your main beat, which is retirement, and some of your hosts are of a certain age where Medicare and how we do Part B and Part D and all that figures in. What impact will the tax cut, which robs the government a lot of revenue, have on some of these things many of us were counting on in retirement?
I'm concerned about Social Security and Medicare both. I think, not this year, but I think if the Republicans stay in control of Congress after the midterms, you could look for efforts to cut both programs in different ways.
Say it loud, my brother, say it loud.
Social Security in particular is a worry for two reasons. One is we're facing a shortfall in the program's revenues around 2034, so something needs to be done there, whether it's an increase in taxes coming into the system or some cutting of benefits or some combination. There's going to be a forcing event at some point. The other thing that's kind of an undercovered story, and I'm wrapping up now a big in-depth look at this for Reuters, is the emerging, I would call it just a customer service crisis at the Social Security Administration itself that stems from budget cuts to their administrative budget that's been going on since 2010 as a result of all the sequestration, et cetera, back in the days when we cared about deficits.
Right.
You remember that?
Yeah, I just, under a Democratic
so long
president.
ago.
Social Security has lost almost 4,000 employees. 60 offices have been closed around the country. And there are huge backlogs. You've probably heard about the disability backlog, where people, there's at least 3-year waits. People are literally dying waiting to get their disability adjudication. But it goes way beyond that, even just more routine stuff that can take a year or more to get taken care of. I interviewed somebody yesterday, a low-income Social Security recipient in D.C., who's been waiting a year for a $700 refund on a mistake that was made in her Part B premium for Medicare being deducted from her Social Security. It wasn't supposed to be, long story short, wasn't supposed to be being deducted. She's waiting a year for $700. It's a very meaningful amount of money to this lady.
Yeah.
This kind of stuff's going on all over. And we're just what it is we're choking this agency. Congress is choking this agency. It's absolutely outrageous.
Before, we don't have time to get into the whole Medicare thing, but I'm experiencing far more denial of coverage now that I'm covered by Blue Cross Medicare Advantage. they take my Part B premium and they handle all the rest. Well, handling all the rest means they're cutting. This is a private insurance agency. It takes my federal money and taxes I've paid into for years and years and years, and other workers are paying into now to keep me
So
healthy in my retirement.
you're like in the managed care version of Medicare, it sounds like.
Well,
That's what it is.
It's supposed to be a PPO, but they're
Yeah.
treating it like managed care.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
it stinks.
Yeah. Well, that's a
Coverage
whole
I had just 2
yeah.
years ago through the same plan, I'm suddenly being cut off.
Yeah, and that's a whole long story. We can do another episode.
We'll bring you
just
back
Tom,
on
we'll
that.
have to bring you on the show to talk about that
Any,
sometime.
anytime.
I'm not going to talk about media and other news. I think we would just want to do one more plug for the book itself.
Yeah, yeah. We would love to have you back, but you plugged into a very meaningful subject with the retirement crew that's now reaching retirement. The huge baby
We all are
boomer
getting our
Yeah.
Social Security now.
Yeah.
glitch. So you've got yourself a real good employment stream there.
There is demand for the information.
Mark Miller, author. Jolt is the name of the book. Stories of Trauma and Transformation. Good luck with the book.
Thank you.
And with
Thanks,
your tour behind
Thanks
it.
for coming on. We'll
Mike,
see you
thanks.
at the YMCA.
You bet. You bet. You will.
All
Tom,
right.
thank
Have
you.
a
Thanks
good
to all of
weekend.
you.
You are listening to Live from the Heartland, WLUW 88.7 FM and WLUW.org. Check out this show on youtube.com/Heartland Media. Tape of many, many shows are there. We are now going to hear from Tukiman. Space.